In his first-hand account of the sinking of his vessel, Captain Maclelland would write, quote, "Everything seemed all right when we left the grounds off of Point Pelee late Saturday afternoon and started for Cleveland. It was blowing fairly hard, but we were making out in good shape until about supper time, when I noticed we began to have a tougher time making headway, and I wasn't surprised when John Bourrie, the second mate, came in and said we were taking water over the side and going down into the hold."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Capsizing of the Sand Merchant.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Sand Merchant was, as her name suggested, a sand dredge. The 1,981-ton steel-hulled vessel was based out of Montreal, but she was well-traveled, and her crew on her final voyage was from many parts of Canada. It was a crew with many family ties. Second Engineer Martin White had brought along his 20-year-old son, Harry, who signed on as a deckhand for his first season with the ship. There were also the 3 Dalt brothers, 2 of whom were wheelsmen and 1 of whom was a pump engineer. First Mate Drinkwater had also invited his wife along for one last trip for the season, since it was already mid-October. In total, there were 26 people on board the Sand Merchant on the 17th of October, 1936, as she left Point Pelee, bound for Cleveland. The ship departed Point Pelee around 2 p.m., and by 4 p.m., it had started to blow hard and show signs that a storm was coming. The wind and rain began to batter the Sand Merchant, but there was no immediate alarm. The Sand Merchant was a ship with a good reputation, and she was considered one of the best self-unloaders on the Great Lakes. For a couple of hours after the storm gained power, the Sand Merchant was able to hold her own, but when she began to take on water, Captain Maclelland knew that they were in danger. They had a cargo of 2,200 tons of wet sand. Adding water into the mix would quickly overwhelm the ship. They quickly put the pumps to work, but soon the Sand Merchant would develop a list to port. Captain Maclelland considered the ship in serious trouble at this point, and he sounded the alarm for everyone to come up on deck. Crane operator Gifford would say that he had not considered them in danger, even after he was called on deck, and had not been made aware of the list. He was not alone. Even as the ship started the list, some of the off-duty crew members had remained asleep in their bunks until First Mate Drinkwater came to wake them up and tell them to get up on deck. Whether or not the crew was completely aware of the danger they were in, Captain Maclelland began to do everything to try to signal for help. First Mate Drinkwater was ordered to start burning flares, but they ran out quickly, and no help arrived. Once they were out of flares, the men on the boat brought their bedding up on deck and made a large bonfire on the deck. Captain Maclelland would say that if there had been any ship near them, they would not have been able to miss the large fire and come to investigate. But there did not seem to be any other ships on the lake near them, even though they were only about 14 miles from Cleveland at this point. There was no other means to call for help on the ship. They did not have a wireless. Wireless was only required by Canadian law for ships that carried passengers, and it was estimated, in the wake of the loss of the Sand Merchant, that only about 15% of cargo ships on the Great Lakes had wireless. The crew of the Sand Merchant kept the fire going on deck for about an hour, while the list got progressively worse. But when no help arrived, Captain Maclelland had to plan for them to leave the ship. The mood on the ship was growing more grim, and at least a couple members of the crew knelt on the deck to pray at one point. At 9 at night, Captain Maclelland ordered that the ship's boats be made ready. The process of preparing the boats proved to be difficult due to the fury of the storm. But Captain Maclelland would later brag that his crew had been as calm about it, even in those circumstances, as they would have been if they were just conducting a drill. Even with the boats having been made ready, Captain Maclelland did not immediately give the order to evacuate the ship. The sand merchant seemed to recover her balance a little for a moment, and Captain Maclelland had the vain hope that the pumps might be winning against the water. Then the ship took an even more dramatic pitch, and he knew that they were going to have to leave her. It was a struggle for Captain Maclelland to even reach the other side of the pilot's house due to the extreme slant so that he could pull the ship's whistle, the signal that the people on board were to take to the boats. Captain Maclelland said that it felt like less than a minute after he had blown the whistle that the sand merchant gave a sudden lurch without warning and fell entirely over on its side. Though Captain Maclelland never mentioned it, Gifford would say that the end of the sand merchant came when the ship was forced into a trough due to the list, and it was this trough in the waves that would cause the ship to tip over as it did suddenly. Captain Maclelland could not actually give any details about what happened next. He had managed to fight his way out of the pilot house and escaped from the ship into the water somehow, but after that, he had been knocked out when something hit him while he was struggling in the water. He did not remember anything past that until he felt someone pulling his hair. Not knowing what was happening, but in pain from having his hair pulled, Captain Maclelland admitted that he had started a fight, but deckhand John Eidson, who had grabbed him, managed to hold on and pulled him over the bottom of one of the ship's upturned boats. Here, they were able to pound him on the back until the water was out of him, and he returned to his senses. Almost everyone had escaped from the sinking sand merchant due to having been thrown in the water when the ship capsized before she went down, and they were all wearing life belts. Unfortunately, the ship capsizing had also capsized the two boats, and the survivors were forced to cling to them the best they could. Captain Maclelland was not the only person that Eidson had managed to save. He had pulled wheelsman Herman Dalt to safety before he had found Captain Maclelland in the water. Among the people clinging to the same boat as Captain Maclelland were Herman Dalt's younger brother Amos, as well as first mate Drinkwater and his wife. Joseph, the eldest of the three Dalt brothers, was reported to have not escaped from the sand merchant when she suddenly capsized. Due to his injured condition, at first Captain Maclelland remained over the boat rather than clinging to it. But every time a wave crashed over them, he was washed off of it, and either Herman Dalt or Eidson would be forced to save him and pull him back to safety. Later, he seems to have joined the others in clinging to the boat, though the details are unclear. And even then, he was washed away at least once, and Dalt had to go after him. Their boat drifted so close to the other boat with its own cargo of 7 people clinging to it that sometimes people were pinched between the two. The people on the boats had no means to send any signals to any passing vessels in the darkness. The lights for the boats were tied beneath the capsized boats, and the survivors were not able to reach them. Several times they saw ships pass close to them, but there, without any light to show, the ships passed by them, and the people clinging to the boats could only watch them helplessly. There was little to hold on to on the sides of the boats, and Herman Dalt would later show that he had gray paint ground into the tips of his fingers from digging his nails into the wood. The water was icy cold, and the waves were still pounding on them. As the survivors held on for hours, they grew numb and tired. They called out their names for the first few hours so people would know who was still with them in the darkness, but some of the people on the boats began to get too tired and numb to speak any longer. With daylight, there came a higher chance of rescue, but it also grew even colder, and the waves were still crashing over the boats. Around daylight, the two boats lost sight of one another for a time, and Captain Maclelland's boat started to drift towards shore, which raised their hopes. But unfortunately, the current would soon sweep them back into the lake and away from land. They could eventually see the other boat again, though, with people still clinging to it off in the distance. First Mate Drinkwater and his wife had been clinging to the boat together, and they let go of the boat together, without a word to anyone. They would be the first to let go on the captain's boat, but they would not be the last. Herman Dalt was by far in the best condition out of everyone who was holding onto the captain's boat, and he held onto his younger brother, Amos, for 4 hours, slapping his cheeks and shouting at him to try to keep him awake. Eventually, Herman Dalt was too tired to hold on to his brother any longer, and Amos also slipped away without a word. Herman Dalt had also dedicated himself to keeping deckhand Eidson awake and holding on. Eidson was one of the youngest members of the crew, and though he was described as very muscular, he was weakening before Herman Dalt's eyes. Captain Maclelland was also in poor condition, and Dalt began to scream at both of the men, hurling abuse at them and hitting them, telling them to hold on. It seemed as though Eidson was going to be the next to drop off, probably at any moment, when the Bessemer and Marquette No. 2 was seen in the distance, as was Thunder Bay Quarries. Both ships were large iron-carrying cargo vessels. Captain Wilson of the Bessemer and Marquette would say that the storm they had just weathered was one of the most fierce storms in months. The two large iron-carrying vessels had chosen to anchor and ride out the storm, rather than attempting to make it into the port during such conditions, and then had ridden out the storm with no difficulty. The size of their ships had given them a great advantage over the relatively small sand merchant. The Bessemer and Marquette headed toward the boat with Captain Maclelland on it, while Thunder Bay Quarries headed to pick up the other boat. Soon, the remaining crew of the sand merchant was pulled to safety, weak and in shock, but for the most part in surprisingly good health in spite of the ordeal. Tragically, if Amos Dalt had been able to hold on for half an hour more, he would have also been saved. As it was, only 7 people out of the 26 who had been on board the sand merchant had survived. The exception would be the second engineer, Martin White, who was in such poor condition that while the other survivors were interviewed by the newspaper, he remained in a hospital room and the nurses refused to allow anyone to speak with him. It was speculated that he was in so much shock that he did not even know that he had lost his son, but this proved to not be the case. Just like on the boat that Captain Maclelland had been on, 2 of the members of the crew had let go of the boat that White had been on without a word, as though they had fallen asleep. Harry White, Martin's son, was different. As he dropped off, he had told his father to try to save himself. There would not be any of the survivors who were not touched by the tragedy that they had just experienced. While Martin White was isolated in a hospital room in terrible shock, Gifford told the papers that this was going to be the end of his career as a sailor. He had been the manager of a furniture store for 14 years before the Great Depression had hit, and he had turned to sailing to make ends meet. He viewed his most recent experience as a sign that it was time to return to land for good. He was not alone either. Jack Muse, the sand merchant's repairman, also announced to the papers that he was done with ships for good. In his case, it was not his first shipping disaster. He had been on the Panoil when she had blown up at Muskegon, and had been forced to escape in the boats on that occasion as well. For Jack Muse, 2 shipwrecks were 1 shipwreck too many. He had been good friends with Amos Dalt, and when they were home, they usually did double dates since they were both in steady relationships. Muse's picture of his girlfriend had survived the experience of the sinking of the sand merchant, but Amos had not, and Muse vividly told the newspapers about parting with his friend on the deck of the sinking ships and wishing one another good luck as they went over the side. Luck had only favored him, and he no longer had any desire to be part of a crew. While the rescued were recovering, both physically and mentally, the search was on for where the sand merchant had sunk. There was a concern that she could prove to be a navigational hazard depending on where she had sunk, and how deep the water she was in proved to be. The owners of the Sand Merchant also hoped to find the ship and salvage her, since she had been an expensive vessel. She would not be found until 1937, however. Captain Maclelland said that the ship had sunk about 6 miles off of Avon Point, Ohio, but he could not give an exact location due to the fury of the storm. Captain Maclelland tried to help the searched, as did a compass adjuster who lived on the waterfront and had seen the lights of a vessel in the storm disappear, but they were not rewarded with success. Finally, they turned to the United States engineers for the Great Lakes and posed the question of how they could determine where the ship had gone down. They had the lights sighted by the compass adjuster, but since he had only seen them, and it was hard to tell how far out they had been, it was not much help. The engineers made a canvass up and down the coast, and finally found 2 other people who had seen the light out on the lake. It was through triangulating the angles of the 3 people who had sighted the light of the Sand Merchant that they finally found the resting place of the Sand Merchant, a novel enough way to find a sunken ship at the time that it made the news under the headline, "Missing Ship's Grave Found by Mathematics." There would be no salvage for the Sand Merchant, though. She will be left as she was found, completely upside down, her upperworks buried deep in the mud at the bottom of the lake.
For more information, please see the Somerset Daily American from October 19th, 1936, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.